They came from the deep forests, from the endless steppes, from mountains shrouded in mist and valleys cut by rivers that no Roman had ever seen. To the Greeks, they were the babblers, the foreigners whose tongues clattered with strange sounds that did not fit the measured cadence of Hellenic speech. The word barbaros was born not of hatred at first, but of distance, a line between those who spoke the language of the polis and those who spoke otherwise. Yet across that line stretched lives as complex, fierce, and enduring as any within the marble walls of Athens or the markets of Corinth. When the Mediterranean world gazed outward, it saw shadows moving at the edges of its maps. To the north lay the Celts, whom Herodotus described as living at the ends of the earth, a people both mysterious and terrifying, painted in bright colors, their hair lime-washed into golden spikes. They were warriors and wanderers, farmers and priests, their druids chanting rituals beneath sacred oaks. To the east surged the Scythians, horse-lords of the steppe, drinking fermented mare's milk, riding with bows that bent like serpents and living lives inseparable from their herds. These were not the savages of Greek imagination, but whole civilizations, carried not in stone and marble, but in memory, song, and blood. The Persians, mighty heirs of empires, had once looked upon the Scythians with both awe and frustration, for no walls could stop them, no fortress contained them. Darius the Great had led an army across the Danube to bring them to heel, only to find himself chasing smoke, for the Scythians fought without cities, burning their grasslands before the invader could feed his horses. They were the first lesson to the empires of the south, that there were peoples who could not be broken in the manner of states, because their strength lay not in fortresses, but in the very mobility of their lives. In the west, Celtic tribes swept like storms across Europe, a vast migration of peoples who toppled cities, clashed with Rome in its infancy, and even dared to sack the city itself. For the Romans, that scar would never heal. The smoke of their burning temples and the memory of Gaulish swords in the very heart of the Forum remained like a haunting, whispering warning of what barbarians could do if Rome faltered. From that moment, the fear of the barbarian was woven into the Roman soul, a shadow stalking every legion, every wall, every emperor's dream of eternal dominion. Yet even as Rome feared them, it also came to know them. Trade routes laced the forests with the cities of the south. Amber, furs, and slaves flowed down from barbarian lands, while wine, silver, and finely worked weapons traveled northward. Barbarians were not faceless enemies. They were mercenaries in Roman armies, allies in wars of convenience, sometimes even kings recognized by treaty. And through this exchange, the line between civilization and barbarism blurred, even as Rome insisted it remained stark. But beyond these early encounters lay a deeper truth, one that neither Greeks nor Romans fully grasped, that these so-called barbarians were not merely raiders at the gates, but inheritors of their own traditions, bearers of cultures that would one day reshape Europe itself. The Celts with their intricate art and warrior nobility, the Germans with their assemblies of free men and laws, spoken aloud, the steppe peoples with their unmatched mastery of the horse, all these strands would entwine with the destiny of empires carving the path from antiquity to the medieval world. And so in the beginning, the story of the barbarians is not only a tale of clash and conquest, but of contact, exchange, and transformation. They were the mirror in which Rome and Greece saw themselves, sometimes distorted, sometimes magnified, but always indispensable. The untold story begins not with the fall of empires, but with the first recognition that beyond the known world lived nations just as fierce, just as proud, and just as eternal. They spread across Europe like fire through dry grass, a people without a single king, yet bound together by common tongues, common gods, and the restless spirit of migration. The Celts emerged from the heartlands of Central Europe, where rivers curved through valleys rich with grain and forests teemed with game. Archaeologists would one day name their world after villages, Hallstatt Laten. But to their contemporaries they were simply the Gauls, the Celtae, the tribes who lived beyond the mountains and forests of the north. To the Greeks, their presence first became known along the Adriatic, where Celtic traders brought amber and tin, metals that glittered like treasure in the markets of the south. But it was not trade alone that announced their arrival. It was the clash of iron against bronze, the thundering of war chariots, the sight of warriors painted with spirals, their necks adorned with golden torques, their voices rising in battle chants. They were not bound to the walls of cities. Their power lay in mobility, in the strength of the clan, in the reputation of warriors who could drink deep from the skulls of their enemies and compose poetry in the same breath. For centuries they surged outward, pressing into Iberia, crossing into Italy, even striking into the Balkans and Anatolia. The world of the Mediterranean trembled as these northern peoples descended in waves, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as settlers. They founded new kingdoms in distant lands, Galatia in Asia Minor, a Celtic realm in the very heart of Hellenistic empires, where their descendants would one day speak Greek, but still carry the memory of their tribal forefathers. Their moment of greatest terror came in the early days of Rome, when a warlord named Brennus led his warriors across the Alps. They poured into the Italian plain, scattering Roman legions like leaves before the wind. In 390 BCE, they reached the gates of Rome itself. The city fell, its temples burned, its elders cut down. For 7 long months the Gauls occupied the ruins, and when they finally withdrew, it was only after Rome paid them in gold. Woe to the vanquished, Brennus is said to have sneered, hurling his sword onto the scales to demand still more tribute. That humiliation seared itself into Roman memory. From then on, every child of Rome grew up with the tale of the Gauls at their gates, a nightmare that justified centuries of vengeance. But to imagine the Celts only as marauders is to miss the depth of their world. Their society was ordered not by kings alone, but by a complex web of clans, each tied to its warriors, farmers, artisans, and priests. At the heart of their spiritual life stood the Druids, keepers of law and law, whose words were stronger than swords, for no battle could begin until the Druids had given their sanction. They preserved memory, not in books, but in the human voice, in chants and stories that carried the weight of lore across generations. Their gods dwelt in rivers, groves, and stones, demanding sacrifice, sometimes of cattle, sometimes of men, binding their tribes to the natural world around them. Their art spoke in curves and spirals, forms that seemed to move as if alive, decorating swords, shields, and jewelry with designs that carried hidden meanings. Where Roman art sought realism and proportion, Celtic art reveled in abstraction, in symbols of power that danced just beyond understanding. To hold a Celtic blade was to carry not just a weapon, but a piece of myth. Yet even the might of the Celts could not withstand forever the rising tide of Rome. In time, the legions adapted, hardened, and struck back. Julius Caesar would make his name in Gaul, waging wars of extermination that killed by the hundreds of thousands. The tribes fought with ferocity, but their independence was also their weakness. United, they might have broken Rome. Divided, they fell tribe by tribe, until their lands became provinces, their leaders reduced to client kings. Still, their legacy endured. The Gauls who once terrified Rome became part of Rome's empire. Their sons serving in the legions, their daughters marrying into Roman families, their language slowly giving way to Latin. Yet in their festivals, in the persistence of local traditions, in the names of rivers and mountains, the Celts remained. And far to the north and west, in the misty isles beyond Britain, their kin would carry on, shaping cultures that would long outlive the empire that once conquered them. The story of the Celts was not only one of loss, but of transformation. They were the first of the barbarians to leave an indelible mark upon Rome, and Rome in turn left its mark upon them. In this exchange lay the pattern of centuries to come, for the relationship between the so-called barbarians and the empire was never one of simple opposition. It was a dance of fear, admiration, hatred, and assimilation, a dance that would define the fate of Europe. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, in the vast forests and marshlands of northern Europe, lived a people who seemed to the Romans at once primitive and terrifying, yet strangely noble. They were the Germans, a name the Romans would use to describe dozens upon dozens of tribes, each with its own chieftains, its own customs, its own gods. To Rome, they were an enigma, untamed, scattered, poor in cities and gold, but rich in spirit and unyielding in their independence. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing at the height of imperial power, described them with a mixture of disdain and admiration. They had no temples of stone, he said, but worshipped their gods in sacred groves and dark woods, where mystery and fear gave shape to divinity. They drank strong beer, fought with long spears and round shields, and lived in wooden halls surrounded by their cattle. Yet they also cherished freedom, with a fierceness that Rome itself had long abandoned. In their assemblies, warriors gathered to make decisions, raising their spears in assent or clashing them against their shields in thunderous disapproval. To the Roman eye it was chaos, to the Germans it was the voice of the people. The tribes were many: Cherusci, Suebi, Marcomanni, Chatti, Saxons, Goths, Vandals, names that would one day echo across history like thunderclaps. For now, they lived as farmers and raiders, moving through forests where Roman legions hesitated to tread. They were poor in gold, but wealth to them was measured in cattle, in bonds of loyalty, in the songs that preserved a warrior's name after death. At first, Rome sought to conquer them as it had conquered Gaul. Legions marched beyond the Rhine, building roads and forts, claiming land in the name of empire. For a brief moment, it seemed the Germans would be absorbed, tamed, and turned into another province. But in the year 9 CE, deep in the Teutoburg forest, that dream was shattered. 3 Roman legions, led by the governor Varus, were ambushed by a coalition of tribes under a chieftain named Arminius. Trapped in rain-soaked forests, harried on every side, the legions were annihilated. 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, their standards captured, their eagle banners lost. The Rhine became Rome's frontier, and beyond it lay a land they would never truly master. The shock of Teutoburg rang through the empire like a funeral bell. Augustus himself, it is said, tore at his robes and cried, "Varus, give me back my legions!" Rome would strike back, launching campaigns of vengeance, but the forests remained unconquered. The Germans had taught the greatest empire on earth that there were limits even to Roman power. Yet contact between Rome and the tribes did not cease. Trade flowed across the Rhine: wine, weapons, and silver for furs, slaves, and amber. German warriors served as mercenaries in Roman armies, fighting for the very empire they defied. Roman generals forged alliances with chieftains, playing one tribe against another, binding them with treaties that never lasted long. It was a relationship of shifting loyalties, fragile truces, and constant tension. But as the centuries passed, the world began to change. The empire grew rich, its cities swelling with wealth, while the tribes beyond the frontier felt the hunger of their growing populations. Pressures mounted from the east, where other peoples, still more fearsome, began to stir. The Germans, once scattered and small, began to unite into larger confederations. The Alemanni, the Franks, the Goths, tribes merging for survival and for strength. Their chieftains became kings, their warbands became nations in embryo, and their eyes turned ever more hungrily toward the fertile lands of the empire. The Romans, for all their power, could not ignore the slow, steady pressure of the north. The barbarians were no longer simply raiders at the gates. They were becoming a force of history, learning Rome's ways even as they prepared to challenge it. They fought with Roman weapons, spoke in part with Roman words, and yet carried with them traditions utterly unlike those of the empire. Their loyalty was not to a distant emperor, but to their kin, their chieftains, and their gods. What the Romans could not see was that these peoples, these Germans they feared and despised, would one day carve new kingdoms from the corpse of the empire. They would be Rome's destroyers, but also its heirs, carrying forward fragments of Roman law, language, and faith into a new age. The untold story was already unfolding in the shadows, as warriors sat by the fire in wooden halls, hearing songs of ancestors, dreaming of victories yet to come. For in the forests of Germania, the seeds of Europe's future were already sown. They came like a storm rolling across the horizon, a people whose arrival seemed less like migration than the wrath of some forgotten god. From the endless steppe, beyond the rivers that marked the edge of the known world, the Huns appeared. No one knew from where they came. Some whispered of distant Asia, others of lands beyond imagination, but what they brought was terror. To the Romans and the Germanic tribes alike, they seemed less human than spectral, fierce horsemen who lived their entire lives in the saddle, born riding and dying in war. The chronicles tell us of faces scarred by ritual of men who disfigured their children's skulls to make them appear alien and terrifying of warriors who could fire arrows at full gallop with a precision unmatched by any archer of the West. They needed no cities, no walls, no ploughs. Their wealth was their herds, their power their mobility, their law the command of their chiefs. Against them, the fortresses of the frontier seemed suddenly fragile, for the Huns were not bound by rivers or forests. They moved as fast as the wind, appearing where least expected, striking with speed and vanishing before legions could respond. When they burst into Europe in the late 4th century, the effect was catastrophic. The Germanic tribes, already restless under Roman pressure, were now driven before this onrushing tide. The Goths, pressed hard by Hun raids, surged across the Danube, seeking refuge within the empire itself. Desperation turned to rebellion when Roman promises of food and land turned to exploitation and abuse. In 378, the Visigoths rose in revolt, and at the Battle of Adrianople they crushed a Roman army and slew an emperor. It was a wound from which Rome would never recover, and behind it lay the shadow of the Huns. To the tribes of Europe, the Huns were both oppressors and allies, depending on the moment. Some were enslaved, compelled to fight in Hun warbands, while others found opportunities to serve them, gaining power under their fierce overlords. But for all their brutality, the Huns also became a strange kind of unifier. They forced the scattered Germanic tribes to move, to gather, to carve out new destinies within the borders of Rome. They were the hammer that shattered the fragile balance of the late empire, driving migrations that would not be stopped until Rome itself lay in ruins. And then came Attila, the scourge of God. To his enemies he was more than a man. He was an incarnation of divine punishment, sent to scourge the world for its sins. To his people, he was the ruler who bound them together into an empire of the steppe, stretching from the Danube to the Volga. He demanded tribute from the Eastern Empire, and when it was not paid, his armies descended like locusts, burning cities, slaughtering populations, leaving silence where once there had been life. Yet for all his devastation, Attila was also a shrewd diplomat. He played the Romans against one another, the East against the West, emperors against generals, tribes against tribes. His court was a place where barbarian chieftains and Roman envoys alike came to kneel, bringing tribute to the man who could make or break kingdoms. Even in his simplicity, dressed in plain garments while his lieutenants glittered in gold, he radiated a power that emperors envied and feared. In 451, he struck westward, invading Gaul with an army of Huns and subject tribes. The fate of Europe seemed to hang in the balance, but on the Catalonian plains he was checked, not by Rome alone, but by a coalition of Romans and Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Franks, and others who chose in that moment to resist the terror of the Huns. The battle was vast, the slaughter immense, and though Attila was not destroyed, the spell of his invincibility was broken. A year later, he turned to Italy, ravaging its cities, marching toward Rome itself. Panic seized the empire, and then, in one of history's great mysteries, he turned back. Some said it was famine that halted him, others that his army was weakened by plague. The story that endured was that Pope Leo himself met Attila on the road and persuaded him to spare the city, invoking divine authority before the scourge of God. Whatever the truth, Attila withdrew. Soon after, he died suddenly, perhaps of a burst blood vessel, perhaps poisoned by those closest to him. His empire, held together by his will alone, disintegrated within a generation. The Huns vanished as quickly as they had appeared, dissolving into the steppe absorbed by other peoples. Yet their impact remained. They had set entire nations in motion, shaken the foundations of Rome, and left behind a legacy of fear and legend. In their wake, the Germanic tribes surged deeper into the empire, carving out realms of their own. Without the Huns, the migrations might have been slower, the fall of Rome delayed. With them, the world was remade. The thunder of their hooves faded, but the reverberations carried on, shaping the destiny of Europe for centuries to come. When the Huns faded into the mists of the steppe, the peoples they had once driven before them did not fade. They remained, stronger now, hardened by exile and war, poised to seize what Rome could no longer defend. The Visigoths, who had once fled across the Danube seeking shelter, now strode across the empire as conquerors. Their journey had been long and bitter, humiliated by Roman corruption, forced into revolt, victorious at Adrianople, wandering for decades as a nation without a homeland. But in 410, under their king Alaric, they accomplished what no enemy had done for 800 years. They sacked the city of Rome. The eternal city, the heart of empire, was thrown open. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered its treasures, while the Roman world reeled in disbelief. Though they spared much, the great churches, the lives of most citizens, the psychological blow was shattering. Rome was no longer untouchable. Its walls could be breached, its streets filled with foreign soldiers, its treasures carried away in barbarian hands. Alaric himself did not live long to savor the triumph, dying soon after, but his people endured. They moved on into Gaul and then into Hispania, carving out a kingdom that would last for centuries, blending Gothic rule with Roman law, their kings crowned not as destroyers, but as heirs to the land they had seized. Southward, another people carried the tide of change, the Vandals. Driven from their ancestral homelands by the Huns, they wandered through Gaul and Iberia before making a daring crossing into North Africa. There, under their king Gaiseric, they built a naval power that would dominate the western Mediterranean. In 455, they too entered Rome, not as sackers in haste, but as looters at leisure, stripping the city of its treasures and carrying them across the sea. To this day, the word Vandal echoes with the memory of that devastation, though the truth is more complex, for the Vandals were also builders of a kingdom, rulers of Carthage, masters of trade and fleets, a power that rivaled what remained of the empire itself. To the east, the Ostrogoths emerged. Once vassals of the Huns, they now forged their own destiny. In the late 5th century, under the brilliant and pragmatic Theodoric the Great, they swept into Italy. The last vestiges of Roman rule in the West crumbled, as Theodoric established his own kingdom, ruling not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a king who cloaked himself in Roman traditions. He preserved the Senate, maintained Roman law, and presented himself not as a destroyer of civilization, but as its guardian, albeit under Gothic rule. For a time, Italy flourished anew under his reign, a strange fusion of Roman administration and Gothic might. Thus the Germanic tribes, once feared as marauders, had become something more. They were kings now, founders of dynasties, rulers of lands that had once seemed beyond their reach. Their kingdoms bore the scars of their violent births, but also the seeds of continuity. They adopted Roman titles, Roman laws, even the Christian faith, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the empire they had once fought. Rome had fallen, but it had not vanished. Its culture, its institutions, its dreams lived on, reshaped and carried forward by those once called barbarians. For the Romans, this was a bitter irony, that their conquerors became their heirs. For the tribes, it was destiny fulfilled. They were no longer at the edges of history. They were its makers. From Spain to Africa to Italy, the map of Europe and the Mediterranean had been rewritten, not by emperors in marble palaces, but by warriors who had once gathered in forests and marshes, swearing oaths before their gods. The age of the barbarian kingdoms had begun. Among all the tribes that surged across the Western world in the wake of Rome's collapse, one stood apart for its endurance. The Franks, once a loose confederation along the lower Rhine, were not the first to sack Rome or to seize its richest provinces. They had no Alaric, no Gaiseric, no Theodoric to dazzle history with sudden conquest. Yet their strength was of a different kind, patient, rooted, resilient. While other kingdoms flared brightly and then faded, the Franks built something that would outlast them all. Their rise began in Gaul, where Roman power had once been strong, but now lay in fragments. Into this land of vineyards and old cities marched the Franks, led by their warlords, settling first as federates, allies of Rome, before becoming masters in their own right. Among their early kings, none was greater than Clovis. A warrior of cunning and ferocity, he defeated rivals one by one, crushing the Alemanni, humbling the Visigoths, bringing all the Franks under his banner. By the year 500, he stood as the most powerful barbarian ruler in the West, a man whose ambitions stretched beyond plunder to the building of a kingdom. Yet it was not only the sword that gave Clovis his strength. In a moment that would echo through history, he embraced the Christian faith. Unlike the Goths and Vandals, who had adopted Arian Christianity and stood apart from the Roman Church, Clovis was baptized into the Catholic faith of the Latin world. With this act, he bound his people to the bishops, the clergy, the traditions of Rome itself. The Church became his ally, and the Franks became not outsiders but champions of the faith, defenders of a Christian order that was struggling to survive amid the ruins of empire. The Franks absorbed Roman ways, but they did not lose their own. Their law codes, first spoken and then written, carried the memory of tribal customs, vergild, the price of a man's life, assemblies where freemen made their voices heard, loyalty bound by oath rather than decree. Yet these customs merged with Roman administration, Roman learning, Roman order, until something new was born, neither wholly Roman nor wholly barbarian. It was the beginning of medieval Europe. In the centuries that followed, the Frankish kingdom expanded, fractured, and reunited. Dynasties rose and fell, but always the Franks endured. By the 8th century, their realm stretched across Gaul and into Germany, the largest and most stable successor to Rome in the West. From their line would come a man who crowned himself emperor, who claimed to restore what Rome had lost, who would be called Charlemagne, father of Europe. But even before that great age, the foundations were laid. The Franks, once scattered tribes along the Rhine, had become the builders of kingdoms. Their rise was less dramatic than the sack of Rome, less dazzling than the fleets of the Vandals or the courts of the Ostrogoths, but in its quiet resilience it was more enduring. While others fell, the Franks grew. While others clung to fragments, the Franks forged unity. In their story lies the bridge between the ancient and the medieval, between the age of barbarians and the birth of Europe. And so the tribes who once gathered in forest clearings, swearing by their gods of war, now knelt in stone cathedrals, anointed by bishops, crowned as kings. They had begun the journey from barbarians to rulers, from raiders to nation-builders. The map of Europe was changing, and in the heart of Gaul the Franks were writing its future. When the legions departed from Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind a land rich in Roman ruins, but poor in defences. For centuries, the island had been a province of empire, its towns laced with stone walls, its villas adorned with mosaics, its people accustomed to Roman law and order. But when the empire could no longer spare its soldiers, Britain was left to fend for itself. In the absence of Rome, chaos took root. The Picts pressed down from the north, the Irish raided from the west, and soon new enemies came from across the sea. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, seafaring peoples from the coasts of northern Germany and Denmark. At first they came as mercenaries, hired by desperate Romano-British warlords to defend against other raiders. But soon they turned on their employers, carving out lands of their own. The Saxon shore, once a Roman defensive line, became the foothold of a new world. Their conquest was slow and brutal, not the sudden overthrow of a city, but the grinding advance of settlement. Village by village, valley by valley, the newcomers spread, pushing the native Britons westward into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, or across the sea to Brittany. The old Roman towns crumbled, their forums and baths abandoned, their villas falling to ruin. In their place rose wooden halls, farmsteads, and villages of the newcomers, who brought their own language, their own gods, their own ways of life. These peoples were pagans, worshippers of Woden, Thor, and Freya. Their priests sacrificed at sacred groves. Their poets sang of heroes who faced fate with grim resolve. Their society was rooted in kinship, in loyalty to the warlord who led them into battle, in the bonds of blood and oath. To the Romans they were the epitome of barbarism, yet in truth they carried with them traditions that would one day shape a kingdom. By the 6th and 7th centuries, their dominance was clear. The island was divided into kingdoms, Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, each ruled by a king in a wooden hall, surrounded by warriors who feasted, fought, and fell in endless struggles for supremacy. It was a violent age, but not without order. Their law codes set down fines for theft, penalties for murder, obligations of loyalty and protection. Their poetry, Beowulf, preserved centuries later, spoke of courage, honor, and the inevitability of death, a world where men sought glory that outlived their brief lives. Yet even here, change was coming. Missionaries from Ireland and Rome crossed the seas, bringing with them the Christian faith. The old gods yielded to the cross. The wooden halls gave way to stone churches. The kings of the Anglo-Saxons began to style themselves not just warlords but rulers ordained by heaven. Their runes gave way to Latin script, their oral songs to written chronicles. Britain, once a province of Rome, had become something entirely new. It was no longer Roman, no longer Celtic, no longer wholly Saxon. It was a land forged in the crucible of invasion and settlement, where barbarians became kings, and kings laid the foundation for a nation that would one day be called England. The Anglo-Saxons, like the Franks across the sea, carried forward both the memory of their own tribal past and the legacy of Rome they had never truly known. They were heirs to two worlds, shaping a future that was at once barbarian and civilized, pagan and Christian, fractured and yet destined for unity. And in their story, as in all the stories of the tribes, we see the great transformation of Europe. The passing of the ancient world into the medieval carried on the shoulders of those who had once been dismissed as barbarians. The story of the barbarians did not end with the settling of the Goths, the rise of the Franks, or the kings of the Anglo-Saxons. A new storm gathered in the north, born of icy fjords, rugged coasts, and restless hearts. From Scandinavia came the Vikings, the last great wave of raiders who would haunt the imagination of Europe for centuries. To their neighbors, they were a terror, striking without warning from the sea, their long ships gliding silently through the mist. Monasteries, towns, and villages lay exposed along rivers and coasts, their treasures plundered, their people taken as slaves. To the chroniclers of the age, they were God's punishment, demons from the sea, the scourge of Christendom. But to understand them only as marauders is to miss their deeper story, for the Vikings were also traders, explorers, and settlers, and in their voyages they reshaped the map of Europe. Their world was born of hardship. The lands of Scandinavia were harsh and unforgiving, with short summers and long winters, where only the hardiest could survive. In such a world, strength, courage, and loyalty were the highest virtues. Their sagas spoke of heroes who defied fate, who sought fame so that their names would echo in memory long after death. Honor was life, and a life without it was not worth living. Their ships were marvels of craftsmanship, sleek and flexible, able to cross oceans yet also sail up shallow rivers. With these vessels they could strike deep into the heart of kingdoms, appearing suddenly where no one thought them possible. The coasts of England, the rivers of Francia, the monasteries of Ireland, all fell victim to their raids. But they did not come only to steal and destroy. Some stayed, carving out settlements where once they had pillaged. Dublin was founded by Norsemen. York became a Viking stronghold. Normandy a gift of land granted to them in exchange for peace. Their horizons extended far beyond Europe. To the east, they sailed the rivers of Russia, trading with Byzantium and the Caliphate. To the west, they crossed the Atlantic, discovering Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. They were not merely destroyers of worlds, they were connectors, linking distant lands through trade, exploration, and conquest. The fear they inspired was real, yet so too was the admiration. Their warriors were relentless, their kings ambitious, their culture rich in poetry and art. The Norse sagas, though written down later, preserved a memory of their deeds, their struggles with fate, their sense that the world was destined for both glory and doom. Christianity eventually tamed them, as it had other tribes before. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway brought baptism to their people, building churches where once sacrifices had been made to Odin and Thor. The wild raiders became rulers, their descendants blending into the fabric of the very kingdoms they had once attacked. The Normans, heirs of Viking settlers in France, would go on to conquer England, Sicily, and beyond, carrying the legacy of the Vikings into the High Middle Ages. The Viking Age was short, spanning only a few centuries, yet its impact was vast. They shattered the illusion of safety in Europe, forcing kingdoms to adapt, fortify, and centralize power. They spread far beyond their homelands, leaving imprints from Newfoundland to Byzantium, and in their tale the last echoes of the barbarian world faded into the dawn of medieval Christendom. For with the coming of the Vikings, the story of the barbarians reached its final chapter. No longer were they merely the others, the outsiders to civilization. They had become part of the kingdoms they touched, their children kings, their ships symbols of daring, their sagas a part of Europe's shared heritage. The age of invasion gave way to the age of consolidation, and the barbarians of old became the ancestors of nations. By the close of the first millennium, the map of Europe had been redrawn countless times. The Roman Empire, once thought eternal, had been shattered, yet its fragments lived on in stone walls, in roadways, in law, and in language. The barbarians who had once pressed against its borders, raided its towns and toppled its emperors, were no longer merely outsiders. They were rulers, citizens, and shapers of a new order. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths had forged kingdoms in the south, blending Roman administration with their own warrior traditions. The Franks had unified vast territories in Gaul and Germany, absorbing Roman institutions while extending their own law and custom. The Anglo-Saxons had taken Britain from Roman hands, creating a culture at once Germanic and Roman, pagan and Christian. Even the Vikings, who had terrorized coasts and rivers, became settlers and rulers, leaving traces in Normandy, Ireland, and England. Across the continent, a pattern emerged. Barbarian tribes had been perceived as destroyers, yet in truth, they were also builders. They carried the legacy of Rome forward in new forms, merging it with their own customs to create hybrid societies that could endure. Roman roads and cities provided infrastructure. Roman law offered a framework. The barbarians supplied the energy, the martial tradition, and the flexibility to survive in a fractured world. Out of chaos, order slowly emerged. Religion played a central role in this transformation. As tribes converted to Christianity, the church became a unifying force, linking rulers to their subjects and kingdoms to one another. Bishops advised kings, monasteries preserved knowledge, and Christian ritual replaced the old pagan rites. Yet even in faith, the tribal past persisted. Kings drew legitimacy not only from God, but from ancestral authority. Laws preserved old customs. Warfare remained a proving ground for honor and power. Europe was neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian. It was something new, a tapestry woven from conquest, survival, and adaptation. Economically, the barbarians rebuilt the world. Agriculture spread, towns revived, trade routes reopened. Cities were smaller than Rome at its height, but they were centers of administration and culture. Art and architecture absorbed both Roman and Germanic influences. Intricate jewelry, manuscript illumination, and monumental halls all reflected a blending of styles. The people who had once been outsiders were now artisans, clerics, farmers, and rulers. Their lives, once recorded only in tales of war and conquest, now shaped the rhythm of daily life across Europe. Politically, the legacy of the barbarians was profound. The very idea of kingship changed. Power was no longer concentrated solely in distant emperors in marble palaces. Kings emerged from tribal councils, warriors' oaths, and dynastic alliances. They negotiated with the church, with neighbors, with former enemies, creating a patchwork of kingdoms that formed the blueprint of medieval Europe. Borders were fluid, yet society endured because of the structures the barbarians had imposed upon themselves, drawing from both tradition and innovation. In the end, the barbarians were not the destruction of civilization, but its rebirth in a new form. They had tested Rome's strength, shaken its foundations, and then carried fragments of its glory into the lands they now ruled. From forests and steppes, from fjords and rivers, they had come to remake Europe, blending the old with the new, creating societies capable of surviving the chaos of the early medieval period. Their story is one of transformation, of endurance, of vision born from necessity. History often remembers them as marauders, as outsiders, as destroyers of a golden age. But the untold story is more complex, more enduring. The barbarians shaped Europe not only through fire and sword, but through governance, culture, faith, and adaptation. They were the bridge from the ancient world to the medieval, the carriers of change who turned ruins into kingdoms and chaos into order. Europe itself is, in many ways, the product of these migrations and conquests. The languages, laws, and traditions that endured in the medieval world all bear the fingerprints of those once dismissed outsiders. In their strength, their adaptability, and their vision, we see the roots of nations yet to come. The barbarians, far from being mere interlopers, were the architects of a new era, the silent hands that shaped the future while the old empire crumbled. Shall I move into Chapter 10, the final chapter, which ties the entire story together, reflecting on the enduring legacy of the barbarians and their place in Europe's long history? As centuries passed, the echoes of barbarian footsteps faded from the forests, plains, and rivers where they had once roamed. Yet their presence remained, etched into the very soil of Europe. The cities rebuilt atop Roman ruins bore the imprint of their rule. The kingdoms they carved from conquest and migration endured, laying the foundations for nations that would dominate the medieval and modern world. What had once been feared as chaos became the architecture of continuity. The story of the barbarians is, at its heart, a story of transformation. They were not merely conquerors, nor were they the destroyers Rome feared. They were carriers of a new order, blending the old with the new, the familiar with the foreign. Their migrations carried not only armies, but culture, law, and tradition, weaving together peoples who might otherwise have remained isolated. In their hands, the fragments of Rome's civilization were reborn in forms both unexpected and enduring. We see their influence everywhere, in the laws of the Franks, which would inform medieval codes across Europe, in the governance of the Anglo-Saxons, which would echo in English common law, in the art and craftsmanship of the Celts and Norse, whose intricate designs would inspire generations, in the Christian kingdoms that rose on lands once ruled by Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and Vandals. Europe itself is a palimpsest, layers of empire and invasion, conquest and settlement, where every stroke bears the mark of those once called barbarians. Yet their story is also a tale of paradox. They were both outsiders and heirs, destroyers and builders, feared and admired. Rome's fall was their triumph, yet Rome's institutions were the tools they used to rule. Pagan warriors became Christian kings, raiders became settlers, ephemeral bands of warlike tribes became dynasties whose descendants would shape continents. The barbarians were neither fully barbaric nor fully civilized. They were the liminal bridge between two ages, the force that carried Europe from antiquity into the medieval era. Their legacy is visible not only in kingdoms and lore, but in imagination. Legends of Attila, Beowulf, Odin, and the dragon-proud ships of the Vikings have endured for centuries, capturing the human fascination with freedom, courage, and the edge of chaos. These stories remind us that history is not only the record of empires, but of the people who challenged them, who reshaped them, who refused to be contained by walls and decrees. And so the barbarians' untold story is revealed not in the destruction they wrought, but in the world they built. They were the hidden architects of Europe, the forces who turned a crumbling empire into a mosaic of nations, whose bloodlines, laws, and legends flowed into the kingdoms of the medieval world. Without them, the map of Europe would have been unrecognizable, its cultures different, its history muted. They were the storm and the seed, the hammer and the hand that shaped civilization in ways Rome alone never could. To call them barbarians is to remember a word born of fear, a label imposed by those who could not see their vision. But history, in its patient unfolding, sees them differently. They were creators, survivors, innovators, and rulers. They were, in every sense, the makers of Europe. Their story reminds us that civilization is not static, that greatness is never guaranteed, and that even those at the margins can leave a mark that echoes through the centuries. From the forests of Germania to the fjords of Scandinavia, from the valleys of Gaul to the shores of Britain, the barbarians lived, fought, and endured. And in doing so, they transformed a world, leaving a legacy that endures in every language, law, and kingdom of Europe today. Their story is complete, yet eternal, for as long as Europe exists, so too does the shadow, the spirit, and the indelible imprint of the barbarians.